Each pope brings something of his own personality and gifts into the papacy with him. Karol Wojtyła, who would become Pope St. John Paul II, brought his charisma, a flair for the dramatic, and a sweeping global vision to the papacy. Joseph Ratzinger brought his extraordinary theological acumen, his Baroque aesthetic sensibility, and a personal shyness into his pontificate. And Jorge Bergoglio has brought his personal humility, his Ignatian spirituality, and his solidarity with the poor into his papacy. So every pope, to some extent, brings something to the institution of the papacy. The question is whether in each of these cases these are simply passing realities associated with a pope's particular biography, realities that will all too easily be forgotten with the election of the next pope. Put differently, in the case of Pope Francis, is what we are witnessing simply a curiosity, a breath of fresh air, an historical anomaly, or does his papacy mark the beginning of something new and decisive in our church? This evening, I will argue that the Francis pontificate has at least the potential to be more than a curious asterisk in the history of the papacy. Pope Francis, I am convinced, is bringing to the church not only a refreshing personality, but a new vision for the exercise of the papacy. He is refashioning what we have traditionally referred to as the Papal Magisterium. We have to acknowledge that an overwhelming majority of Catholics have welcomed his embrace of a simpler, less ostentatious papacy. His move out of the papal apartment, his avoidance of Baroque vestments, his cold calling ordinary Catholics, his pastoral provisions for the homeless at the Vatican, his reassuring message of mercy. Yet there remains a nagging concern for some that this beloved Pope is also introducing dangerous innovations that could threaten the patrimony of the Catholic faith. Just this past summer, 45 scholars and clerics, including several bishops and 2 cardinals, signed an open letter to the Pope in which they announced to him that they saw a dangerous departure from church teaching in 19 different passages in his most recent apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. Even prior to that statement, the American Cardinal Raymond Burke had bluntly warned, quote, "The Pope does not have the power to change teaching or doctrine," unquote. And there we have the key issue regarding this papacy, regarding the Papal Magisterium itself. Can the Pope change church doctrine? Or, to put it differently, should the Pope change church doctrine? These questions, I should point out, are being raised across the ideological spectrum. On the one hand, conservatives are worried that the Pope is, in fact, changing church doctrine, most recently with regard to the indissolubility of marriage. So there are some who see his desire to allow, under very certain circumstances, married couples in so-called irregular second marriages to receive communion. Some have interpreted that as undermining the church's commitment to marital indissolubility. These committed Catholics see this as both a pastoral mistake and a grievous abuse of his authority. Liberals, on the other hand, want the Pope to change doctrine, but fear that he won't, particularly regarding controverted questions on topics such as birth control, homosexuality, and the ordination of women to the presbyterate. So what's going on here? My sense is, to steal a phrase from John O'Malley, there are two issues under the issues. The first concerns how we understand the role of doctrine in the church. The second concerns the actual way in which the Pope exercises his distinctive papal teaching authority, what we generally refer to as the Magisterium. This evening, I will argue that Pope Francis is both modeling a fresh understanding of how doctrine functions in the church, while also enacting a different kind of papal magisterium. Drawing inspiration from Pope St. John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council, Pope Francis is taking us down the proverbial road not taken in the post-conciliar church. In Pope St. John the 23rd's influential opening address at Vatican II, Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, he offered an unambiguous affirmation of the Church's necessary fidelity to its doctrinal heritage. However, the Pope insisted that fidelity to our doctrinal heritage means more than the rote repetition of doctrinal formulas. As he put it in that address, if all we're going to do is reiterate church doctrine, we don't need to have a council. He noted that while we must be faithful to church doctrine, we must also recognize that doctrine grows and develops and can only be understood in particular historical and pastoral contexts. He recognized that there must be a difference between the substance of church teaching and the manner in which it's formulated. And he suggested that the signs of the times that we must read today require us, while being faithful to our heritage, to courageously penetrate more deeply into the meaning of our doctrine and be creative in the way we present it to the world. The authentic meaning of a doctrine can be apprehended, he insisted, only after carefully considering the context in which the doctrine emerged and the context in which it was being appropriated. Vatican II attempted to implement that vision of doctrine, what the French theologian Christophe Theobald has referred to as the pastorality of doctrine. The pastorality of doctrine. John O'Brien gets at the heart of this vision. In the thought of Pope John and Vatican II, he writes, and I quote, "The pastoral had regained its proper standing as something which is far more than merely applying church doctrine. The pastoral is the very context from within which doctrines emerge. It's the very condition of the possibility of doctrine. Doctrine exists to serve the pastoral life of the church, in other words. It is the touchstone for the validity of doctrine and the always prior and posterior praxis which doctrine at most attempts to sum up, safeguard, and transmit." As we know, Pope John died after the first of what would be 4 sessions at the Second Vatican Council, and he was succeeded by one of his closest advisors and confidants, Pope Paul VI. And in Pope Paul's opening address at the beginning of the second session of the council, he addresses, as it were, Pope John. And he says, "You have awakened in the conscience of the teaching authority of the church the conviction that Christian doctrine is not merely truth to be investigated by reason, illumined by faith. No, Christian doctrine is teaching that can generate life and action. And that the authority of the church is not limited to condemning contrary errors, but extends to the communication of positive and vital doctrine, the source of its fecundity. The council bishops themselves, as with Pope John and Pope Paul, had no interest in renouncing the need of the church for doctrine, but rather they wished to place church doctrine within a much richer theology of revelation, where revelation was to be understood not in the first instance as a collection of propositional truths to be memorized and flung at one another in rigorous argument. No, the council presented revelation as first and foremost God's invitation to relationship, God's share of God's self in a life of loving communion. And however we understand doctrine, the council insisted, it always must serve that more profound invitation to friendship and communion, which is the heart of authentic revelation. My colleague Catherine Cornell has observed that prior to Vatican II, when people thought about the notion of doctrinal humility, what they thought of was an attitude that one had toward doctrine, rather than an attitude about doctrine. In other words, before Vatican II, individual Christians were reminded of the limits of human reason, and they were encouraged to a humble posture of docile obedience in the face of the authority of doctrine. The church presents it, and it's our task to simply receive what had been presented. Vatican II, however, invited us to a new form of doctrinal humility. This doctrinal humility is evident in the council's insistence that revelation shouldn't be treated as a divine answer book, an owner's manual, providing definitive solutions to every question in our age. In Dei Verbum Article 8, in which it talks about how tradition grows and develops through the work of the Spirit, there's this wonderful line in which it says, and the Spirit will lead the church toward the fullness of truth. In other words, Vatican II shifted us from the notion that Catholics have the truth in our back pocket, as it were, to the Catholic Church growing into truth, which can never be exhausted, right? In the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World Today, Gaudium et Spes, the bishops wrote this remarkable statement. The Church guards the heritage of God's Word and draws from it moral and religious principles. Note, without always having at hand the solution to particular problems. As such, she, that is the Church, desires to add the light of revealed truth to humankind's store of experience, so that the path which humanity has taken in recent times will not be a dark one. Note the posture of doctrinal humility. We, the Church, have something precious in the good news of Jesus Christ, and we should not be bashful about offering it to the world, but neither should we assume that we have therefore nothing to learn from the world, or that we figured out the gospel simply because we can testify to the gospel. All right? This more measured appraisal of the role of doctrine was reflected in one of the Council's most remarkable teachings on what was called the hierarchy of truths. In the Decree on Ecumenism, Article 11, the bishops wrote, when comparing doctrines with one another, they should remember that they, meaning ecumenists here, people who are engaged in ecumenical dialogue, should remember that in Catholic doctrine, there exists a hierarchy of truths, since they vary in their relation to the fundamental Christian faith. So what are the bishops saying here? They're saying, well, of course we have doctrine. Doctrine's important to the life of the church. But we have to remember there's something more basic, more fundamental, right? The good news. God's offer of salvation in Christ by the power of the Spirit. And we have to understand doctrines as relating to that fundamental gospel message, the Council says, in different ways. Not every teaching is going to be equally central. This is reflected in the idea that any catechist who, for example, might be presenting the Catholic faith to interested inquirers and starts with the Immaculate Conception in purgatory has not understood what the council means by the hierarchy of truths. I'm not challenging, by the way, the truth of those statements. I'm just saying they don't bear the same relation to the foundation of the Christian faith as Christ crucified and risen and offering the hope of our salvation. All right? Indeed, I would argue it's only through that that you can understand the Marian dogmas, for example. So we might say, by way of summary, that Pope John and Vatican II initiated a profound shift in how one conceives doctrinal or magisterial authority. Pope John wanted a truly pastoral magisterium. He used that term in his opening address. Unfortunately, and I hasten to add, his successors, Paul VI through Benedict XVI, all unambiguously supported Vatican II, all in their own way furthered or advanced certain aspects of the Council's teaching. The fact has to be said that there were key elements in the Council's teaching that were largely neglected in the 5 decades after the Council. Which leads me to Pope Francis. For I am convinced that Pope Francis has taken up the gauntlet thrown down by Pope John, who over 50 years ago called for a truly pastoral magisterium, and we are now seeing that enacted in our midst. One of the characteristic features of this pontificate is its thoroughly reimagined understanding of the role of doctrine and of teaching authority. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of my presentation is to outline 7 features in Pope Francis's papacy that are suggesting a shift to a different understanding of doctrine and a different understanding of what papal teaching authority ought to look like. First, a truly pastoral magisterium serves a synodal church. Just about a year ago this month, while the Synod of the Family was still in progress, Pope Francis gave what I believe was one of the most important speeches of his pontificate. The occasion was the 50th anniversary of the creation of the World Synod of Bishops. But in that speech, he spoke not so much of the institution of the Synod of Bishops as he addressed a larger ecclesial principle, an understanding that the church doesn't just convene synods, the church must be synodal. And he plays on the etymological meaning of the word synod, which comes from the Greek synodos, which could be rendered traveling on a journey together. In that speech, he asserted, and I quote, "It is precisely on this way of synodality, of our traveling on a journey together, where we find the pathway that God expects from the church of the 3rd millennium. This principle," he admitted, "is an easy concept to put into words, but it's not so easy to put into practice. For a church really committed to walking together, has to resist the temptation and Catholic neo-scholasticism, which I won't get into, but was a school of theology that was dominant for a good century and a half, at least prior to Vatican II, a neo-scholastic tendency he put to divide the church into 2 groups. The ecclesia docens, the teaching church, and that was the magisterium essentially, and the ecclesia decens, or the learning church. Right? This division was reflected in one of the encyclicals of Pope Pius X, Via Mentor Nos, in which he describes the church as a societas inequalis, an unequal society comprised of 2 ranks, the teaching church, the pastors who teach, and the learning church, the rest of us, who docilely do what the pastors direct us. All right? And so when Pope Francis says we need to be a synodal church, he says we have to move beyond that notion. There are not 2 different churches, one part teaching, the other part learning. A synodal church, he insisted, must be whole and entire, a listening church governed by the practice of mutual listening. He then masterfully linked this listening church to the council's teaching that all the faithful were given a supernatural instinct, what we called the sensus fidei, a supernatural instinct for penetrating ever more deeply God's word, for applying it more profoundly in our lives. In what could be termed the Magna Carta of his pontificate, his apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, Joy of the Gospel, he had already challenged bishops to broaden their practice of synodality, which for him meant consultation. He writes, and I quote, "The bishop will have to encourage and develop the means of participation proposed in the Code of Canon Law and other forms of pastoral dialogue out of a desire to listen," note this, "to everyone and not simply to those who would tell him what he would like to hear." Unquote. Evangelii Gaudium 31. What is particularly welcome in this text is the recognition that consultation, real consultation, is more than gathering together safe voices that function as little more than an ecclesiastical echo chamber. You see, I suspect that most bishops and pastors and provincials and theology department chairs and deans and university presidents all are convinced they're consultative. We all consult people. The question is, who do we consult, right? Because most of us seek out the opinions of others that will confirm the obvious superiority and wisdom and courage and prophetic fervor of our particular course of action. Pope Francis has a far more bracing notion of what consultation must mean. A consultation that wishes to be a genuine listening to the Spirit, he insists, must attend to a wide range of voices, including those, if you will, in ecclesial exile. A second key feature of Francis's pastoral magisterium is his recovery of the council's sense that I spoke of earlier, of doctrinal humility. For Pope Francis, just as for the bishops of Vatican II, doctrine plays a necessary role in the life of the church. However, church teaching should not be used as an excuse for suppressing disagreement and doubt. Few, if any, modern popes have spoken so honestly about the positive place of doubt and the dangers of false certitude. In one of his many interviews, he remarked, and I quote, "If one has the answers to all the questions, that's proof that God's not with him. It means that he's a false prophet, using religion for himself." He said the great leaders of the people of God, like Moses, have always left room for doubt. About a year ago, he addressed the Italian Bishops' Conference, and he said Christian doctrine is not a closed system opposed to genuine questioning, doubt, and interrogatives. This is a very different notion of doctrinal commitment. Pope Francis clearly embraces the Church's doctrinal teaching, but he does not seem to see them as closing the door on all church debate. His commitment to doctrinal humility is in further evidence in his insistence that formal doctrine be comprehended in relation to the more basic Christian message. Francis, to be honest, has gone into the dank papal closet where some of the most threatening council teachings have been carefully stowed away. And he has brought into the light of day the council's provocative teaching on the hierarchy of truths, the conviction that not all church teachings are related in the same way to the basic Christian message. He writes, "Pastoral ministry in a missionary style is not obsessed with the disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed. When we adopt a pastoral goal, and note the dominance of pastoral throughout all of this, and a missionary style, which would actually reach everyone without exception or exclusion, the message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time, most necessary. The message is simplified, while losing none of its depth and truth, and thus becomes all the more forceful and convincing. The work of the magisterium must shift away from the policing function to which it has become habituated and toward the defense and vivid and up-to-date expression of the core values of the Christian tradition. One of the key terms in Francis' pontificate is decentralization. In Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope wrote, "Nor do I believe that the papal magisterium should be expected to offer a definitive or complete word on every question which affects the church and the world. It's not advisable for the Pope to take the place of local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory. In this sense, I am conscious of the need to promote a sound decentralization." This commitment to decentralization has led the Pope, for example, to give an unprecedented emphasis in his documents to the teaching of regional episcopal conferences. In Amoris Laetitia, on the family, joy of the love, he cites documents from various regional episcopal conferences 10 times. And his encyclical, Laudato Si, on care of our common home, he cites regional episcopal conferences 20 times. A couple of years ago, a Brazilian bishop disclosed a conversation with Pope Francis in which he claimed that Francis expressed some sympathy regarding the pastoral urgency of the current priest shortage in Latin America. But Francis said to this bishop from Brazil that he felt a proposal for married priests should not come from the Pope, but from regional episcopal conferences. This commitment to decentralization is also reflected in his efforts to reform the Roman Curia. Indeed, as Robert Mickens has pointed out, perhaps one of the most interesting elements of his curial reform doesn't have to do with shutting down certain dicasteries and creating new ones and so on and so forth. The most significant change is to recognize how little is coming from the Curia at all. In fact, just this week we received an instruction on cremation, and the first thing I thought about is, oh my God, I can't remember the last time we got a document like this. Under the previous pontificates, there was a veritable deluge of instructions and notifications emanating from every Roman dicastery. One of the things that you note is Francis doesn't seem to be eager to have them issuing document after document after document. He wants to let the local bishops deal with many of these issues. A fourth feature of a pastoral magisterium is exhibited in Pope Francis' embrace of the power of the symbolic gesture. This may be the most creative contribution that he's making. And here he's picking up on Pope John Paul II, right? That in my view, in a postmodern papacy, popes are going to have to teach less by juridical decree and more by symbolic gesture. Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope in the modern period, was an undisputed master of the symbolic gesture. For many of us, our recollection of his pontificate comes by way of a series of compelling media images. His kissing the ground upon the first visit to a country, his sitting in a prison cell in prayer with his would-be assassin, and more bracingly, his wagging his finger at a kneeling Father Ernesto Cardenal, chastising him for his alliance with the Sandinista movement. And I don't have it up here, but one thinks of a number of images of the moving vulnerability of a pope stooped over by debilitating illness in his final years. Here we encounter one of the central contradictions of Pope John Paul II's pontificate. For on the one hand, he clearly understood the way in which in a media-saturated world, the symbolic gesture could teach more powerfully than a juridical document. On the other hand, he continued to rely on those very documents, issuing more pages of ecclesiastical text than any pope in history. Eager to dialogue with the world, he was less open to dialogue within the church. Pope Francis has shown himself to be the equal of his predecessor in the employment of the symbolic gesture. One could argue that more than in his 2 encyclicals and 2 apostolic exhortations, Francis has evangelized, has taught, has exercised his papal magisterium more effectively through the symbolic gesture. One thinks of his dramatic transformation of the Holy Thursday washing of feet ritual, enacted while visiting a juvenile detention facility and washing the feet of women and even Muslims, or his embrace of a man deformed by horrific tumors. Francis, like John Paul II, has grasped the power of the symbolic gesture. But unlike his Polish predecessor, he has been reluctant to exercise more punitive forms of authority in the church. Fifth, a pastoral magisterium must be self-critical. Francis believes that an authentic pastoral magisterium must exhibit a healthy dose of self-criticism. That is, church leaders, if they're to teach effectively, have to demonstrate that they can be critical of themselves and their own failings. Francis has frequently denounced a form of neo-clericalism that he sees as rampant in the church. In his recent apostolic exhortation, which I've already mentioned several times, Amoris Laetitia, on marriage and the family, rather than scolding those who have failed to live up to the demands of church teaching and sexuality and marriage, Francis recognized that it has often been church leaders who have failed the people. And he criticizes clergy who are too enamored with rules and a spirit of judgment, while bemoaning a stress on, quote, doctrinal, bioethical, and moral issues, unquote, that failed to provide practical support for people facing concrete struggles of one kind or another. Still another feature of Francis' pastoral magisterium is his commitment to the primacy of adult moral discernment. He does not wish to treat adult Catholics as if they were children. We are adult disciples of Jesus, called to exercise our own moral discernment in living out that discipleship. And as disciples, he is convinced the concrete conflicts we encounter are often, and this is a word he loves to use, messy. It has a technical theological meaning. Our concrete choices, he taught in Amoris Laetitia, are often circumscribed by factors beyond our control. We find ourselves, in other words, in less than ideal circumstances. We recognize that they're less than ideal circumstances. We recognize we made mistakes that brought us to this point, right? But he says you still have to help people where they are in that moment to find a way forward. In such circumstances, he says, we cannot rely on the rigorous application of juridical norms, but we must engage in the practice of authentic, mature moral discernment. The Pope models here an authority rooted in a ministry of accompaniment. He explores further the demand for an individual practice of discernment, and he also talks quite honestly about the need to form consciences. Indeed, in chapter 2 of Amoris Laetitia, the Pope laments that for church leaders, and he includes himself, he says, we also find it hard, we church leaders, clergy, pastoral ministers, we find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations. And in my favorite line in the entire document, he says, "We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them." This represents, may I suggest to you, lest we get too smug, a bracing challenge to liberals and conservatives alike. For all are tempted to a kind of paternalism, both liberal and conservative varieties, that assume that we understand better than the people we are ministering to what their conscience asks of them. Huh? When considering those whose relational commitments fall outside of church norms, Francis offers what we might call a preferential option for mercy and inclusion. Pastors must discern, quote, which of the various forms of exclusion currently practiced in the liturgical, pastoral, educational, and institutional framework can be surmounted. Now, I want you to get what he's saying in there. Which of the forms of exclusion in our church at the liturgical, pastoral, educational, and institutional level can be surmounted? All right? This is not a repudiation, by the way, of church doctrine. This is what doctrine looks like when it is actually put to the service of ordinary believers. Finally, a pastoral magisterium does not offer premature doctrinal pronouncements. Note the key, premature doctrinal pronouncements on controverted issues. At both the extraordinary and ordinary assemblies of the Synod on the Family, Pope Francis was insistent that there should be no preemptive effort to remove controversial topics from consideration. He encouraged the synodal participants not to be afraid of disagreement. Later, reflecting on the fruit of the synodal assemblies, in Amoris Laetitia, the Pope remarked, and I quote, "The complexity of the issues that arose revealed the need for continued open discussion of a number of doctrinal, moral, spiritual, and pastoral questions." Note, this is not someone rejecting the doctrine of the church. He's simply saying there needs to be more room for open discussion in that context. He writes, "I would make it clear that not all discussions of doctrinal, moral, or pastoral issues need to be settled by interventions of the magisterium. In fact, relative to previous popes, one of the things that's striking when one reads Francis is how infrequently words like heresy and dissent appear in his speeches. He seems to be far more comfortable with the language of question, doubt, struggle, disagreement. And with some important exceptions, he welcomes that disagreement as an occasion for honest dialogue. Here I'm reminded of the great medieval Dominican Thomas Aquinas, who once cited with approval Aristotle on how we should deal with people with whom we disagree. Thomas writes, and he's talking about Aristotle here, "In selecting and rejecting opinions, a person should not be led by love or hate concerning who said them, but by the search for truth. So Aristotle says we should love both, those whose opinions we follow and those whose opinions we reject. For both study to find the truth, and in this way they are our collaborators." Now, by way of conclusion, what the pastoral magisterium is and is not. So it's this last feature that I just mentioned about not coming to premature closure that brings us back to the questions with which I began my reflections this evening. My argument here has been that a narrow focus on whether the Pope has changed church doctrine or should change church doctrine risks missing something more fundamental. The question we should be asking, in other words, is not whether Francis agrees with doctrine X or wishes to change doctrine Y. Rather, what we should be asking is, how does Francis situate our doctrinal heritage within the life of the Church? And how is he enacting a style of teaching authority in keeping with this understanding? For I fear that many liberals and conservatives alike are unwittingly embracing the very kind of doctrinal magisterium that Francis is trying to put behind us. Let me explain. Conservatives who fear doctrinal change, I think, sometimes suffer from a too narrow and ahistorical conception of doctrine, one that assumes that doctrines, once they've been articulated, are immune from any further development. They fret that by extending the possibility of communion to those Catholics in irregular second marriages, Francis is changing church doctrine on marriage. Yet they fail to understand that our teaching on marriage has a long history of dramatic change and development across the centuries, one marked by numerous changes and new features. For example, it was not until well into the second millennium that we came to an agreement on what constituted a sacramental and indissoluble marriage. Or, for that matter, who were the proper ministers of the sacrament. Liberals, by contrast, are generally in favor of and even impatient for doctrinal change on any of a host of their favorite issues. Yet their disappointment in Pope Francis on this score also reflects the mistaken view that doctrinal change and development occurs primarily from the top, by ecclesiastical fiat. In fact, history shows us that it's seldom how things work. Doctrine does indeed change and develop, but rarely do popes instigate the change. Rather, church teaching generally evolves gradually when pastoral contexts shift over time and new insights emerge such that previous doctrinal formulations, though always containing considerable truth, now simply no longer mediate the saving message of God's transforming love in all of its dimensions. Consider the Church's condemnation of usury, the prohibition against garnering financial gain by charging interest to those to whom you have lent money. This was condemned in the Old Testament, and it was taught that way for centuries in the Church. Yet Catholicism no longer prohibits the charging of reasonable interest for the lending of money. How did this teaching change? For it was not reversed by a single papal decree. Rather, there was a gradual and halting pastoral discernment that the teaching, at least in its classical formulation, no longer served the central values it was intended to protect, namely the welfare of the poor. When Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Liberty brought about a substantive change in the Church's teaching on religious liberty, it did so only after a good century of ecclesial discernment by theologians, bishops, and even government officials, that the previous teaching no longer did justice to the changing political context of the modern world. The British papal historian Eamon Duffy captures the much more circumscribed role of papal teaching in this process. I quote, "Definitive papal utterances," he writes, "are not oracles providing new information. Rather, they are adjudications that appear at the end of a wider and longer process of doctrinal reflection, consultation, and debate, often extending over centuries." Magisterial teaching should conclude our tradition's lively engagement with a particular question, not preempt the consideration. A truly pastoral magisterium calls for an exercise of teaching authority that never forgets, that, as John Henry Newman put it, quote, "Truth is the daughter of time," unquote. Truth is the daughter of time. A pastoral magisterium does not claim to always have all the answers, nor does it always have to provide absolute solutions to every controverted issue. A pastoral magisterium acknowledges the here and now normative character of current church teaching, while always keeping open the possibility of further insight. So we might ask, which is more important? For a pope to act decisively in changing a given church teaching, or to carefully cultivate an ecclesial atmosphere in which the church might explore controverted questions with bold debate and an openness to new insight, and an openness, moreover, to how the Spirit can work through that shared conversation. Let me be clear. Our church leaders are called to be faithful to our doctrinal heritage, yet they serve our doctrinal heritage best, not by wielding church doctrine as a club, but by heeding Pope Francis' injunction to abandon a place of safety and certitude and to move from the center to the peripheries of human existence. As our pastoral leaders, Pope, bishops, priests, deacons, lay ecclesial ministers, as all of our pastoral leaders become accustomed to meeting the people in the streets, listening to their concerns, attending to their wounds, they will know, even if only gradually, as through a pastoral connaturality, how the church's doctrine can best be employed or revised to most faithfully announce God's profligate mercy and solidarity with the poor, the suffering, and the wounded of this world. This, my friends, is what a pastoral magisterium looks like. Thank you.